Welcome to On Documenting Indigenous Food Cultures. This discussion is a part of a series of public lectures and discussions organized by Science Gallery Bengaluru for its first digital exhibition, Phytopia. For Phytopia, we hope to bring together engineers, scientists, designers, artists, and biohackers to create an experience where visitors can learn and explore beyond the kitchen, the lab, and the farm. This program is organized in collaboration with Bangalore International Center. A warm welcome to today's speakers, Dolly, Kikon, and Nilanjan Bhattacharya. Dolly will be joining us shortly, but Nilanjan is here with us. Nilanjan is an Indian filmmaker, artist, and writer. He has produced and directed several acclaimed films and diverse media artworks. Nilanjan received the President's Award twice for his documentaries Under the Sun and Johar, Welcome to Our World. Some of Nilanjan's other works are Rain in the Mirror, 90 Degrees, and Fishing Out of Time. His film, Johar, Welcome to Our World, is being screened as a part of Phytopia and is available for viewing till the end of the exhibition. It explores the intricate relationship the Adivasis of Jharkhand have with their forests. The film documents traditional recipes, the medicinal qualities of various herbs, weeds, and fruits, and traditional knowledge of the sustainable management by the Adivasis. Hi Nilanjan, we're so happy to have you here. If you could begin by giving us some background and context about the production of your film, that would be great.
I'll just quickly start because it's interesting, a correlation or a coincidence that like Indian Institute of Science has a role to play in this kind of like the way I started working long back. In 1990s, my brother was doing his PhD in Indian Institute of Science under Professor Madhav Gadgil, the renowned ecologist. So I visited him and then I happened to meet Professor Gadgil and got to know his works, vast range of works he was doing in Western Ghats and biodiversity register and all this. And then he's studying his work, reading his work, interacting with him. I was interested in people's knowledge system, and then started visiting different parts of India and came up with a film on biodiversity called Under the Sun. And then while doing that, I was finding that one thing is very interesting about our food culture, like the local people, especially the Adivasis, the tribals, the indigenous people, their food culture, which is very much connected to many other things which don't look at. So that got me interested, and then much later I started thinking of making a film, and then I came up with Johar, which I was interested to explore much more areas, but then when I started with Jharkhand, I realized that how complex it could be, and it took me really more than 1 year to really understand that what I could capture. And it was an amazing experience. That's how I started with, and I'm still working on food and indigenous food culture itself. So that's the, in nutshell, like that's the background of that.
Okay, thank you so much, Nilanjan. Our speaker, Dolly, is also here with us. Welcome, Dolly. I'd just like to introduce you to our audience. Dolly Kikon is a senior lecturer in Anthropology and Development Studies program at the University of Melbourne. Her legal advocacy work and research continues to focus on land ownership on resource management in Northeast India, including extra-constitutional regulations like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Dolly's film Seasons of Life, Foraging and Fermenting Bamboo Shoot During Ceasefire is being screened as a part of Phytopia and is available for viewing till the end of exhibition. It follows 3 women in a village in Waka district of Nagaland as they labor to forage and ferment tender bamboo shoot, a food item that is cherished across several Himalayan households in South Asia. Welcome, Dolly.
Thank you.
If you could just begin by giving us some background about the film and how you went about making it, and also the lives of the people who you documented through this film, that would be great.
So I would really like to thank the Science Gallery Bangalore for inviting me, and I'm zooming in from Australia, in Melbourne, to be precise. in terms of my location. I work here in this country, and the entire idea of looking at food, conflict food, and my current work on fermentation is largely being done here. And so I would like to start this conversation by acknowledging that I live on indigenous land, and I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and future here in Australia. In terms of, I think, food, it's quite surprising, and this is something that I always say. If I look at my journey as a writer and as an activist, anthropologist with my law background, when did it start and how? I think it started more than, I think, a decade ago. And it started, I really started thinking about this. How did I get into food, and why now? The first piece that I wrote on food was in 2012, and it was called Tasty Transgressions. And I was looking at my field site where I was conducting field work along the foothills of Assam and Nagaland, and I was looking at food cultures. My first book ended up being a book on mining and extraction. I think this is something that I trace in Nilanjan's movie as well, in film, in terms of the coal mining. And it's a book on mining and militarization, but I still ended up having a chapter on food. So I think the attraction and the pull was there already. But it goes much before that as well. After law school, when I joined the civil and political rights movement in India, I worked on a lot of fact-finding groups, including my legal advocacy group, Still Remains, the campaign to repeal Armed Forces Special Power Act and against state violence. I remember, among many other things, as a very young law graduate, that in the villages where I would go with my human rights team to do fact-finding, one of the counterinsurgency tactics for the Indian state was actually to burn down the crops, right? And then to make sure the cattle and the livestock were killed. And this is something that we see around the world as well. And mainly so, I think, in terms of really the Adivasi indigenous people in India, whether it's the Red Corridor that we call, in terms of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, but also Northeast India with a long history of counterinsurgency. And this is something that's remained in my mind, even as a young law graduate. Across the villages where we would go to do fact finding, we witnessed burnt livestock, burnt granaries, orchards that were chopped down. And ironically and quite tragically, this was also a tactic that the ethnic armed groups adopted, so that when they would attack one another in terms of ethnic cleansing, they would do the same thing. Right? And this is something that stayed with me for a long time. So today, when I get into food, and my current book on food as well, I've always looked at food through the lens of pathos, right? As suffering, not something that's always joyful. And I think that's something that traces very well in Nilanjan's movie as well. So even as storytellers, I'm very eager to be part of this conversation, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dolly and Nilanjan. I would just like to remind our audience that Dolly and Nilanjan will be available to take your questions. So please post them in the Q&A box, and we look forward to passing them on to the speakers. So Dolly and Nilanjan, if you could just, either of you could begin by sort of giving us some insight into why you began documenting food cultures. How did you go about this endeavor, and how did your sort of preconceptions about the food cultures in these spaces evolve as you began researching more and learning more?
So Dolly, you want to start, or shall I?
Nilanjan, please go ahead.
No, because this is interesting, because what Dolly, I would like to extend from what Dolly said, that like she looks at food from a point of view of pathos. That's what you use, no? That's what Dolly said. So it's interesting because I look, not really, this is an interesting way to look at it, or the coinage or the word to use. I obviously, in my film, if you see, and Dolly has seen also, that like there is also that sense of pathos, that sense of loss, that sense of constant being oppressed. But at the same time, I would like to kind of counter, as a filmmaker, pose the positive side of it, the happiness of it. For me, the food also worked as a kind of a tool. And as I see through the journey of over the years, looking at people's knowledge system, people's biodiversity practices, and coming to food, I've realized food is an interesting gateway to talk about many issues about society, because food is something which connects everything. Food is something is connected to pathos. Food is something to connected with hunger. Food is connected to cultural expressions. Food is connected to religion. So for me, food works as a tool to connect everything, and also without being extremely overt, to pass on my opinions, pass on my certain kind of understanding and analysis and critique about what is going on in our society, and especially with the indigenous people. So that's my approach. It didn't happen in one film. It happened as a kind of a journey. Over the years, I have come to a point, and food for me now works as an extremely powerful tool to talk about many things as a filmmaker. So that's my point of view.
Dolly?
So I think I've already said in terms of my, my entry into food, the militarization aspect is very strong, right, in terms of violence. So if we look at the issue of resource extraction or forest, or what we are doing with our land, I think the story is very apparent there. The other thread that I would like to pull through in terms of looking at both the film and my work on food right now is actually to take into consideration and make an entire region like the Himalayas visible, right? And when it comes, and that's why I'm very specifically looking at in my current work on fermentation. And fermentation is such a big part of human, I think, story about food, about sustenance, about survival. So that's a story I want to pull through. The other thread that's important as we talk about food, and particularly in India, is extremely important to point out that it's a country where people are lynched and killed for what they eat, right? So I think food is one of the most politically sensitively dynamite topic. I just finished an essay titled Dirty Food, Racism and Casteism in India. And I never in my life, to be honest, read that amount of Dalit literature on food. And I was so humbled to see what Dalit intellectuals and communities have left for us in terms of its richness and the politics of shame, right? To come from a country like India and to remain untouchable, to make their entire food culture and food world invisible, right? It's astonishingly shameful. And I say that as a tribal indigenous woman from India, where in terms of what I eat and my food, I think is at the heart of conflict, that in 2007, the Delhi police had to come up with a regulation to teach us what to eat and what not to eat because it was causing civic disturbance. The kind of language that the officials and government bodies have come up with in terms of subaltern food or the food of the oppressed in India is very interesting. Because what is known as civic and what is termed as governable citizens in terms of food, right? We're still sticking with food. It's always in the sense of the civic. But the fact that I eat fermented food and my neighbor who is a Tamil Brahmin eats dosa, it's both fermented. You know, there are microbial elements both there. But the fact that my food is dirty and horrible and the police can come into my house and stop me, but the dosa batter is all right, also, I think, shows us the ridiculous level of distinction beyond perhaps the microbial, but at the level of caste and at the level of race. So at this stage, I think pulling this strand from food and pathos, which was really foundational for me to think about it, because for me to be Naga is also to recognize that an entire generation of my ancestors after India's independence at the height of the Indo-Naga armed conflict grew up in the forest, right? So starvation and stories of paddies being burned, granaries being burned is a true history that I should embrace, right? Both as part of my pathos history and at the same time right now as indigenous and extremely determined to see how is it that within citizenship conversations we can include food, like Nilanjan says, as a very important conversation, whether it's to do with the Right to Food campaign, whether it's to do with dealing with starvation, or to do with this entire notion of repugnance and calling a dominant populations food cultures as dirty.
Right. I think that both your documentaries, in a way, show us that food cultures are not just about, these National Geographic kind of, or documentaries made about celebration, but it's also about pain. It's also about the politics of starvation. And most importantly, I think for both your films, Dolly and Nilanjan, I felt that they documented certain traditional modes of knowledge, which would otherwise, sort of disappear if there was no repository of that. So how do you think this can be documented in the future? How do you think this can be passed on? And what do you think is the value of making such films?
Shall I?
Yeah, please go ahead, Nilanjan.
You said how, I don't know, just repeat me the questions, how it can be documented and the value of the documentation, you said?
Yeah, I said that how does one, I mean, there is a certain traditional repository of knowledge that indigenous people have about forests and plants. So I find that your documentaries do sort of show us the importance of this. So what do you think is the value of, beyond this sort of documentation, what do you think is the value of preserving this knowledge?
I'm not the authority to talk about it. Interestingly, there are maybe marginal, not in volume a lot, but there are interesting works have been done in terms of not only food, like the biodiversity knowledge by some ecologists and some others. And interestingly, I often refer to, which is not there in my film, like we need to understand first thing, it's not only about this kind of quote unquote knowledge. It's about everyday practices. If you look at Dolly's film also, they are normally talking about what they do. Like they go and collect and they sell it, and that's how they run. So the knowledge came from the idea of survival, the idea of consuming, the idea of dealing with hunger, feeding children. So while you are constantly dealing with those kind of basic feelings, basic elements of your life, components of your life. So you need to, you definitely, and over many, many years, so you grow a certain kind of understanding around you, around certain components, certain objects, certain elements, in overall about nature. So in that case, that's the knowledge you can talk about, if you can call it knowledge or whatever it is. But I often talk about this, if you look, go a little deeper, I often talk about kind of three things. I call it 3 R's. It comes from certain respect, responsibility, and from there it comes restraint. So if you look at indigenous people, they will be seeing in my film, you'll be seeing they will be constantly worshiping. They're the worshipper of nature. So there lies the respect. And then responsibility. And then if you look at it in my film also there, and if you talk to anyone, they will only take in certain quantity. They don't take everything, like they won't come with a lorry or a truck and then fill everything and then go away. They will take what they need. And then the responsibility is that coming from that idea of survival, they understand that this is for themselves. Because if they take everything in one day, the next year they come back, or after 10 days they come back, they don't have that resources, those food resources. So I think these simple things they understood through their practices. And for me, these are the value, this is the value in entirety, we should really understand. We don't need to mystify this knowledge system. It's about a way of living. And I think the important lies here. Extremely important that we should start talking about it, start documenting about it. And how do you document? There are ways. Dolly is documenting in one way through papers, sometimes in films. People are documenting folk cultures, and then even though those kind of practices are coming in. I'm doing through films, sometimes other works, writing and all this. So that's what I think.
Dolly?
I'm really thinking about these questions and the wonderful answers that Nilanjan is giving, and in a sense, I think encouraging us to think through deeply. And I would say that these are answers, but these are, I think, conversations that, that I'm also having with Nilanjan as I'm listening to him and what he's saying. And I would also like to focus on the two terms that you use. One is knowledge and the other one is value, right? And in terms of looking at knowledge, it's a very interesting word for me, because for the longest time, as tribals, indigenous, Adivasis in India, whatever we say is stupid and dumb. Right? We are not supposed to have brains. Neither are we supposed to have anything that's reasoning. Even in the 90s, when I was studying, in the mid 90s, late 90s, when I was studying in Delhi, the idea or knowledge and that field was always really, really very contested, right? In terms of what knowledge do we bring at the national front. Even today, for instance, if there's anything about the Northeast, people will find me out. But if it's something that's happening in terms of, a national importance, they'll seek somebody in Delhi. Right? So when we talk about knowledge, I do want to make sure that I'm here in this webinar, not because I'm making a claim about indigenous or Naga food, but I'm making a very important claim and a contribution, both Nilanjan and I, in terms of the national importance of being citizens of justice. And I think that is the kind of intervention and knowledge recognition that we need to have. Right? Food is only one of the entry points, like Nilanjan said. It can be anything. It can be about justice, right? It can be about rights. It can be really even about issues of governance. When Adivasi people say, the forest is our custodians and we worship it, isn't that knowledge, right? But there's so much of ridiculing this kind of the spirit world that's there. And I say that ridiculing because I think I'm part of the academy, and the academy is supposed to be really a place where knowledge is produced, right? Knowledge is produced, and reasoning is supposed to be at the realm, at the tip, at the top of the hierarchy in terms of how we seek worldly knowledge. And I think that there's a lot to deconstruct once we look at decolonizing knowledge. And very much so, those of us who watch Nilanjan's documentary, taking from there, how do we deal with resources, right? How do we deal with river? How do we deal with a tree as something that's living? I think that in itself, looking at the root of knowledge, changes and shifts everything. The second point that you invoke is about value, and what is the value of making these movies? For me to be a Naga, it's so valuable. Bamboo shoot is so valuable, right? Fermented food is so valuable. I cannot not see the value in that, both in terms of my heritage and what my ancestors have given me. But when we talk about the value of making this film, value from whose perspective, right, becomes very important. If this is an important topic and it's of national value, I would put that once again, right? It's of a regional value, like the Himalayas, so that we look at fermentation, we look at food, and we link it not only to a forest in Jharkhand, or not only to Nagaland and Assam, but let's say to climate change, right? To environmental sustainability, right? To a global sustainable food culture. So I think that's at that level where Nilanjan and I are both, I feel, trying to make that point, that not to parochialize, not to provincialize the kind of contribution and engagement that we have. And these are important stories which are beyond, I think, the villages that we are telling. It is connecting to us as a humanity in terms of what we need to do about the climate and about global concerns.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Dolly.
but just to add on that point, may I?
Of course.
So no, as Dolly is saying that like it's national, and like I would say it's also international. Why not? Like if you start imagining that way, why do you consider that border? This knowledge flows over the border. Knowledge shouldn't have any border, because you can't patent, especially in this kind of knowledge, you shouldn't. This whole idea you should start contesting and challenging. Because this kind of knowledge, if you go to Africa, you go to Amazon, you will find similar kind of knowledge of indigenous people. Where Dolly is there, go to the indigenous people, they do have knowledge. It's not the only idea of indigenous people, we are terming them indigenous, the people who are in close connection with nature. There is a certain kind of relationship, symbiotic relationship, give and take relationship with nature. So we do all have, but we don't respect. But they do respect, because theirs is directly connected. They don't use technology. So it is international. According to me, the value of this kind of work, whoever is doing it, is extremely, extremely international. Especially the recent crisis showed us we better really start looking at these things and giving them respect and giving them attention, that we should start having a dialogue with this kind of knowledge system. It means I have a kind of a optimistic idea of called creating a sustainability dialogue, where this knowledge will talk to the so-called modern knowledge. You know, this is one way one should start having a kind of exchange. And then we will see what you can take, what is relevant, what's appropriate. And, but it's extremely important that we should give attention to this knowledge system immediately.
Right. So we have some interesting questions coming in from the audience. Arun wants to know, as you both showed in your films, women in tribal households play a very important role. Can you tell us a little bit more about the gender relations of the subjects of your films?
Dolly?
Nilanjan, please go ahead, Nilanjan.
No, but in my film, I didn't explore that. As it is in my film, there are so many things I wanted to look at. And also this is interesting because when Dolly was speaking, I was actually thinking that one way our perspectives are kind of different, because she's one way insider. She made a film on the community that which she belongs to. Whereas I was an outsider venturing into that, and fortunately I have some experience, so the perspectives are different. So I saw that women's, in Jharkhand at least, I can tell you that that's not there in the film, but my experience that rather than in the cities, women are much more equal in many terms, in Adivashi societies, in Jharkhand, wherever I went. So they do have much more say or participation in many situations, but not always. And especially handling the resources and all this, they do contribute. There are studies also done that they do contribute a big way of the collection of non-timber resources and many other things. This much I can tell you. But I didn't follow it in a very minute or in a detailed or long way.
In fact, when I watched Nilanjan's film, Johar, I found the gender element very central to the film. And it was very interesting because the voices of the women are very strong. And I think it shows that a filmmaker was making sure that in terms of diversity and the worldview, that women and children were part of it. And Seasons of Life is my first very, very amateurish documentary. But having been there and handling editing and in terms of what stories do I want to tell, even in terms of scripting it, I think I can say certainly that Nilanjan's politics is very visible in terms of his his sensitivity to which voices should come out. I found it fascinating, and there's a moment where in the film it's darkness everywhere, and the conversation between the toddler and the mother. And I was really amazed that as a filmmaker and as an editor, he did not choose to delete that, right? Because it's darkness everywhere. You can't see anything except for the silhouette of the mother and the child. And that in itself was one of the central moments for me, to understand that world. And the other part was also where the little girl and the woman are picking up the mahua flower. A very, very poignant moment in terms of both the camera movement on the hands and the ground. And the third part was where once again a child, and along with a group of men, women are actually foraging for plants, edible plants. And I think it's very, very amazingly captured. And in my film as well, as you can see, gender, and by gender, I mean not only like women, but men, women, children, the social relation of the society was something I wanted to capture. Foraging, like I showed, was a very women-centric activity. And so this was a point that I wanted to show. And also in my other work that I've written on women, on men-women relationships in terms of the fermentation world. My article, 2015 article called Fermenting Modernity, captured that element. So I think I may not be answering your question directly, but yeah, gender is a very important element. And I found that very much in Nilanjan's film as well.
Right. So Raja Shekhar wants to know that based on your work with Indigenous people, what do you feel about the public distribution system in the context of the variety of food provided and also the universal education in these regions? What are the benefits and what are the pitfalls?
Dolly, you have a specific... No, I'm not an expert on that, like, because I tried to venture into this issue. It's so very complex, this PDS system. And then because I'm making a film for many years, and in Odisha now on indigenous food knowledge system and hunger. I'm trying to look at the relationships. So obviously I need to explore PDS. In the film which you are showing, also PDS system, I have a kind of a glimpse of about PDS, how it didn't work, but the situation has changed. PDS is now, at least in Odisha and many other parts, PDS is reaching people now, more and more. One must accept that, but while I was in Jharkhand, that was long back, 2009-10, making this film, then PDS was not reaching. Main thing was corruption, and then people are not able to get it. But now PDS, like the ration is reaching them. But the issue is the quantity per head. The issue is now the other things are, they are not raising, the environmentalists, the ecologists, and the people who are the right to food people, the right to food people, they don't raise that. Mostly the environmental ecologist lobby, they're saying that this is actually the what they distribute in the thing, like common thing, rice and thing, it's actually destroying the indigenous eating habits, consumption habits, because as we know that in every part of India, we do have a different kind of eating habit, and especially among the Adivasis, among the indigenous groups and some of the tribal groups, most of the cases, they do have, and then most of them who live close to nature, they do have an assorted food practice, consumption habit. So they eat a little bit of rice, they eat a little bit of bajra, they eat a little bit of other millets and grains and all this. So this standardization is destroying that. I don't want to go into detail in this, but that, as you know, that there is I can always talk about other things, which I personally think which is right. It's larger issue because it's connected to this whole idea that way the economy functions. And then if the standardization has a connection or relationship with this whole idea of how the money, how the wealth moves in the in this contemporary time. So the standardization is extremely important, or that unification of food habits is extremely important for the capital in that sense. So diversity is a little bit dangerous for that. So these are big issues, but that's what I think.
So I think, you know, in the areas where I work, I think somebody else would be much more qualified to talk about the public distribution system. But in the areas where I work since my doctoral research days, it was a system that was almost non-existent. And wherever we talk about public distribution system, like many states in India, northeastern states are also alleged to be extremely corrupt when it comes to food distribution. When I was growing up in Nagaland, if you heard that somebody was a director of the food supplies, you knew that the biggest building would be coming up soon. So these are very lucrative positions. I have no proof, but as a child, with my own eyes, I saw everyone part of the public distribution system, government positions, did very well in life along all the localities. So I don't know where the money came from. But in terms of public distribution system, the other rumor is also that a lot of traders do very well because there's also a nexus apparently. You know, in terms of food supplies, and this is in terms of, I think, several $1 million we are talking about, right? So if we have to talk about the public distribution system, I would take Nilanjan's movie as one of the proofs in terms of the poorest and the most marginalized in Jharkhand, with the ration cards not getting food grains. And I will not be surprised if that's the case across the Northeast and across a lot of the Adivasi villages. When it comes to actually the second question about universal education, government schools need to do better. And when it comes to the state that I come from, Nagaland, a lot of the education is either private or it's church-based. So you have the Catholic churches, you know, you have the convents. And so in a sense, I think that is then linked to the kind of education that's coming from a tribal state like Nagaland. I did not go to a government school. I went to a mission school. I went to a church, a Baptist English school. And that's how I learned how to speak English, the language that I'm speaking at the moment. And in a sense, I would look at, I think, universal education as something that's really required because not everyone can pay tuition into that. And it's yet, I think, to be a lot to be desired. So thank you for the questions. These are very important questions linking to governance, PDS, and universal education. And I think rightfully we should be linking it to food and other important topics too.
Thank you, Dolly. So S. Elika Azumi wants to know, foraging and fermentation is an essential practice among the Nagas, but also the tribal communities at large. The practice itself is not entirely women-centric, but largely a part of the home and the community. Now that we see new trends of food revivals, especially among the urban elites, do you have any concerns about the narrative paradigms that can take place or are taking place?
Dolly.
Yeah, thanks. I think when it comes to foraging and when it comes to fermenting, from the work that I have seen, I've seen a lot more women take part in that. I think when it comes to men, they go hunting, they go fishing, but everyday mundane work to do with, let's say, like making fermented soya beans or chopping bamboo shoot into fine pieces for fermenting is definitely a woman's job. It'll be very rare for a man or the men folk, right, to enter the kitchen and do all this labor. When it comes to food, I really didn't get her second part of the question about elite people getting into food and looking at food. It's different, I guess, narratives that's coming out. And the thing with food is that we can't stop, right? We can't stop how it's, you know, how it's presented, how it's how it's consumed. But I think in a sense, I'm looking at the question now. Now that we see new trends of food revival, especially among the urban elites, I'm not quite clear who are the urban elites here. So do you have any concerns about the narrative paradigm that can take place or is taking place?
I may contribute in that. Like I think.
Yeah, so I didn't
like,
get that. Yeah, I didn't get the second part of her question right now in terms of food revivals. Like, is there a particular technique, or is it an item, or is it a process? Urban elites, I'm really not sure in terms of who the urban elites are right here. So yeah, I think some Ilika, if you're there, some clarity would be nice. Thank you.
Nilanjan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, but I think I understood. Maybe I didn't understand, but like whatever. This is an important point I want to make in this connection to this question. You have seen my film, and that exactly at the end I spoke about like that. You know, there will be, because they haven't been given, this food culture hasn't been given any respect or recognition. A day might come when this food will only be available in the upmarket restaurants in remodeled fashion, and then only the so-called elites and who can afford, they will have it in the city. So if you take other example, so in case of food, leave out food, but look at Adivasis, the tribals' lands have been taken away for mining. And then what are you proposing? You're proposing let them give jobs, and then they are the owner of the land, and they will be displaced, and they will work under someone. So, you know, so this is, you are taking away independence, you are taking away them from nature, which is actually their survival, every way of living, and you are detaching them from the same way. This continuous neglect, what Dolly was saying at the beginning, that like you will be in northeastern food, fermented food will be, you will be, you will be punished to preparing that kind of food, whereas others won't. This whole Brahmanical domination and all this. So that way, this constant neglect, and not only neglect, like a certain kind of hatred towards this kind of food culture, and complete elimination from the mainstream or any recognition, will eventually come back to a point where, because there is also this idea of organic, there is this idea of healthy, hygienic food, now it's again and again increasing. So we will find out one day that there are many things, already they found out many things which are healthy, Adivasi food practices. So they will be taken, they will be remodeled, they are already been doing it, and they will be packaged nicely and sold in a very posh upmarket organic store or organic restaurant, whereas these people will be eating the food you eat or you recommend, the rice, dal and everything. That way PDS and giving the same kind of food in PDS, the standardization has a certain politics to play. That's what I was talking about. So it's not an one individual politics of really military operation, really state recognized. It's a large passage of thing with a certain kind of motivation that's being played against them. So definitely there will be a narrative shift, I guess, like if this trend continues. And then eventually, if the people who will be responsible for that shift, they think that they will be the winner, in my own understanding, eventually we won't be the winner. Because we can't be bigger than nature. We can't be bigger than nature. We need to submit to nature and try to understand. And these people are important because they are closer to nature, simply. Not because they are great. Not because every indigenous people are great. They are great people or something. Just simply they're because of their knowledge system is far better in relation to food, in relation to understanding nature. We should learn from them. Simple. That's my way. Maybe not very theoretical, but that's what I understood.
So Dolly, Smitha Dakhore wants to know if you could recommend some readings or authors that can give Dalit Bahujan people a perspective on the caste politics of food in India.
Can he or she write to me, please? My. Can you write to me? Yeah, I'm happy to share a reading list with you. Yeah, so it can be done at an individual level, not to bore the panel.
You also share with me. I need to read more.
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
I should.
Yeah. So can I go back, Gayatri? Can I go back to Ilika's question? So
sure.
Yeah, I think. So here, I think she's asking us perhaps to think about the urban, the local, and one of the perhaps process that I want us, all of us, as you know, sitting around the table and talking about food and indigeneity, important to understand, is also the channelize James Clifford, right? James Clifford, and I think we have to be very careful if we make our food culture static, as though it remains at a particular time and space and it doesn't move. Then I think it's a trap in itself. Right? The fact that I'm first generation, my parents didn't go to university, and now I'm at a university teaching, you know, international kids, also shows that even as an indigenous thinker and an anthropologist, I can go around and I can produce knowledge. And so in a sense, then how do we think about indigeneity, and how do we think about the world that we are making as not something that's static in one place, right? Along with the river or inside the forest in itself. I think both Nilanjan and my film show that people are constantly migrating, and that's the reason why he shows the brick factories as well, right? People are constantly migrating. What knowledge are they bringing? There's a lot of fusion in Naga food that's happening right now, right? So people are using bamboo shoot and king chili and trying to make something that's a Chinese dish. When I look at young people doing Instagram from Nagaland, they're constantly doing like Maggi noodles, and they're putting in, you know, like Naga spices and herbs. Where do we categorize that, right? At what point do we then look at culture, and do we start regulating culture? If we think about then local food, and say that, you know, the food, original and authentic food resides in the village, then what about the capital of Nagaland, Kohima, where there's an amazing food culture? Right? It is urban. It is one of the smart cities in the Northeast, right? As we are talking, Mokokchung was one of the cleanest smart cities, nominated and in a sense given a prize for, you know, just this week, right? So it doesn't mean that Nagas are, you know, only staying in the village. They're staying in the village, and they're staying in the city as well. And that's the reason why I invoke James Clifford, because James Clifford's work, Identity in Mashpee, gives us this challenge, right? When you talk about indigeneity and the indigenous history world, where do you locate? There are three ways he gives us. First, it's the state version. Second, it's the legal version. And third, it's the people's version, right? And which version do we take, and how do we understand this? And I think it becomes very important. Today, I can taste and I can enjoy Naga food, but so can I taste and enjoy Italian food and Punjabi food and Malayali food. And in a sense of understanding that eclectic nature of food and citizenship, I think that's where we need to bring our sharpness and sophistication. I was reading this very wonderful essay by a very young Dalit writer who reminisces about growing up in Telangana and eating winged termites. I grew up eating winged termites in Nagaland, right? And I'm not ashamed to say that it is part of a lot of tribal Dalit Bahujan food culture. And so how do we connect? I think where I'm going in a sense is really looking at both solidarity and at the same time being a witness for one another, right? So that we have already put too many boundaries, right? Like male, female, like, you know, Dalit, you know, Bahujan, like tribal, we have already put too many boundaries. So right now, as we talk about food solidarity, as we talk about taste, how can we merge during this very, very difficult time, right? And think about a sense of shared politics. I think that's where I would like to push us through.
Thanks, Dolly. So Ishwari Abraham wants to know, how did you come to meet Sumoy, Thilongo, and Yanchano, the protagonists? What were some of the challenges that came about in the course of the production of the film, if there were any?
Oh gosh, how honored should I be here? Um, all right, I'll be nice. I'm looking. You know, so in a sense, it was summer when I kind of shot that documentary with my team, and I would like to invoke and call out my team members. Manang, Mademo, Wopen, Hirok, my amazing team, and I have to tell you one sentence each about them. But the protagonist, I had started a communication with the foragers in the village, and I had asked them if it would be okay, and I had sought their permission. They gave me a time, they gave me a date to arrive, and they were waiting for me, and that's how they invited me to go to the forest with them. In terms of the challenges, I thought I was fit. I'll tell you my fitness. I can do like 30 push-ups, right, at one go. So I'm okay. Like I'm quite okay when it comes to fitness. But those women were supermen. I'm telling you, the way they were foraging for bamboo shoot and the elevation. My 30 push-up, forget about it, right, Gayatri? I was like, what are they made of? They had their basket, they had their dao, it's that machete, and they climbed up like they had wings on the feet, right? And I could forget about me following them up because the bamboo groves are so thick. My camera people were also struggling, right? So we were all looking at one another and just dying there. It was impossible to follow them. So that was very, very, I think, challenging. The other challenge that we faced was perhaps then one of the things that's not there in the documentary, and I'll confess, is really a close-up shot of the cutting, right? So for people who are eating, I thought, will understand how it's cooked at the end of the credit, but who have no clue about what is a bamboo shoot, till now they don't know at what point is it cut, right? What is a shoot? And I thought that I couldn't get that shot, close-up shot, so that was one of the regrets that I had in terms of the challenges. The third challenge that I had, which was a fun challenge, I would say, was this fact that my two cinematographers, along with myself, where I'm trying to figure out as a very, very amateur, horribly ignorant anthropologist to do with visuals. One of them was wedding videographer, and the other one was a funeral videographer. Right? So between a wedding videographer and a funeral videographer, I'm, as an anthropologist, trying to capture food and something that's festive and at the same time, right, deep. And it was a hilarious moment because if you're a wedding photographer, the panning of the camera is, either the blue skies and then the wedding gown, right? It has to be like joyful. It's the moment of your life. For a funeral videographer, it's a dead, right? So it's static camera, and then the zoom into the faces of perhaps some relatives or the pastor who is saying a prayer or people who are crying. So even in terms of the visual and understanding what is a frame was challenging, but it was a lifetime of a lesson. Thanks.
Thank you for that very interesting answer, Dolly. I think there's a question that could be directed at you, Nilanjan. How do you, this comes from Aisha Punjabi, how do you study a food culture of a community that you don't belong to?
It's a difficult question. I don't know. I'm a filmmaker. I was interested, as I said in the beginning, that in the course of my work, I was interested, and you may say that, and I've been challenged also. Sometime I was giving a workshop, and I was I'm a Brahmin, so-called Brahmin. So a Brahmin talking about tribal food is a dangerous crime, in a way, from the other side of the thing. But I can't afford to get into this complexity in my head. I can't indulge that. But in the process, I thought that because as a filmmaker, as a creative person, I have certain things to talk about. And I have a very definite critique about the way, as a filmmaker, especially as a documentary filmmaker, the way this society is functioning at this moment, and the way they are practices which are extremely relevant and useful in a country like India, where the poverty is so strong, we are ignoring these practices. We are destroying our nature. So I thought that these are the things that we should really look at without, as I said, that being overt, being extremely, I'm not an activist. So somehow this camera works as a kind of a study tool. It's an amazing study tool. So you need to have perseverance, you need to have persistence, you need to have certain kind of, if you call it luck, or getting interesting characters, nice shots, and contacts, and obviously funding. So no, funding is not obvious. Without funding also I made films, others also made films. So these are the things that which came together and pushed me, and I started. So I can't answer that how really I started studying and I continued, but I'm continuing still. So I don't know how, but maybe these are the motivations, these are the factors that which are driving me still.
Gayatri, can I also like give 2 sentences in terms of how do we study a food culture of a community that we don't belong to, right? I don't belong to the Dalit community, but when I look at the history, I have empathy and I have solidarity for the shame and for the violence they have gone through. And if there's something that I can sense is this spirit that I need to join that resistance and the movement to say, right, that the community historically has been shamed, has been oppressed through many things, including food. When we look at, let's say, the African-American food cultures in the South, right, with the history of slavery, how did they come to eat certain kinds of food? When it comes to, that's why, in a sense of looking at food culture and communities, it also resonates with writing. And that's something that a lot of fiction writers perhaps are also asked. You know, I'm a nonfiction writer, but a lot of my very, very inspiring models who are fiction writers are constantly asked, why don't you have a particular kind of character? And if you remember, Toni Morrison was repeatedly asked, right? Why don't you have a white subject in your fiction? Why? So how do we study a food culture of a community that we don't belong to? How do we study a culture of a community that we don't belong to? By perhaps introspecting in our own politics, and where is that intention coming from? And I think that the work and the production and the output in itself should be a witness of that consciousness and kind of the principle.
Yeah. So Dolly Kelly Donati wants to know, I'm wondering about the significance of fermented food and in particular its smell. Is the smell of fermented bamboo always experienced as shameful? Or is there a sense in which the smell of fermented food and its consumption is taking on new meanings? How do people negotiate these sensory aspects of fermented food?
Whose question is it? Can you tell me the name? Kelly Donati?
Kelly, yeah.
Yeah, all right. All right, so how much time do we have? I love fermented food, and I love the smell of bamboo shoot. For me, it is comforting. For others, it is not. But I think food shaming is part of a very dominant caste-ridden Indian culture that's there. So that's why we have. If you look at food cultures, if you look at recipe books, they say it's part of a family culture, but that's ridiculous, right? If you scratch the food histories of upper caste families, they have secret recipes they hand it down the generation, right? They say that these are family recipes, but there's a really very strong caste element to it in terms of purity and pollution. So in terms of actually the experiencing of shame and shameful food is something, once again, we see a lot among Adivasi, tribal, Dalit experiences, that I would say. And the moment when we are shamed, I think shaming is such a violent process, right? Of once again coming back to the question of knowledge, right? To shame an entire community for what they eat is actually to remove that entire possibility and basis of even talking about food or any kind of knowledge or any kind of assertion that we have in terms of our identity. So I think it's something very deep. So So is now it smells, fermented food taking on a different meaning? I would think so. I would think so. And that's also my quest. And that's the reason why in my very old age I joined Instagram, so that I want to let the young generations coming up be not ashamed, and be humble enough, but be dignified enough to engage with the food that we eat, to be okay to eat winged termites, to be okay to eat akuni, to be okay to eat fermented bamboo shoot, because you eat in Nepal, you eat in Bhutan, you eat across the northeastern region of India, you eat in Thailand, you eat in Vietnam, you eat in China, you eat in Cambodia, you eat in Melbourne, you eat in New York, you eat everywhere around the world, right? So in a sense that we come from a country where food shaming and being humiliated for what we eat is really, once again, I would say, a very, very integral part of a caste logic that's there. And I think we need to call it out. And by all of us together, for Science Gallery to have this conversation, to calling it out, all, I think 85 of us here calling it out, I think it itself is a very powerful moment, I would say. So, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we're running short on time. So thank you so much, Dolly and Nilanjan, for this fascinating discussion and for reminding us that food is not just about exuberance and celebration, but it's a deeply political subject. To the audience, it's very important for us to learn your thoughts and responses to this event. So may I please urge you to fill in the feedback form that's in the chat box and visit the exhibition Phytopia. We have similar talks, events, and workshops lined up over the course of the next 10 days. Let us know what you think and tell us what you think we could do better. And please tell us what you enjoyed about this event too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.